Well, my name is Ruth Kowalski, and I thank God I'm an alcoholic. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Now, when you registered, you were each given an envelope. And if you would just like to check your contents of your handout, you'll find a program, and I'll be giving you some program changes as we progress along this weekend. A questionnaire, which we ask you fill out at the end of the seminar. And this large bundle here, which you'll be using as Joe and Charlie go along on the study of the book. Now, also in there should be a name tag and a bundle of meal tickets. And the arrangement with the dining room is that if you do not present a ticket or a meal, you will be asked to pay for it. The beige tickets are breakfast. The red tickets are luncheon, and the blue tickets are your dinner. And dinner this evening will be in the dining room. Tomorrow evening, there will be a barbecue, and we will announce in the event of rain where that will be held. Okay, now corrections to your program for today and tomorrow. We will be resuming session 3 this evening at 7:30 instead of 8 o'clock. Okay? Friday, session 8 will end at 5 p.m. And session 10 will end at 10:15. I'll just give you those corrections for today. Okay, now over in this far corner here, you will find refreshments. There'll be coffee and juices, and it's seventh tradition, and we ask that you be generous. If there is anyone here who has registered by the day that would like to join us for any meal, Pinky, he's standing right down there at the back with the white hair. Pinky has tickets for sale. Now, breakfast is $5.67, lunch is $10.29, and dinner is $17.27. And those prices include taxes and gratuities. Okay? Washrooms are at the far end of the foyer, just out the door at the back. And Charlie will be suggesting that if you have to get up and use them, to just please go ahead. If you have any problems with your room or lunch tickets, etc., or with the contents of your envelope, please feel free to come to either Pinky or myself. And we certainly hope that you have a fabulous weekend. Now, I don't know how many of you that are in this room right now were here last year. But if you'll notice, if you're new here for the first time, you'll notice that the room is surrounded with pictures. And there are little blurbs under each picture to tell you what that picture is all about, or who the person is, or what part they played in our AA history. And perhaps as John goes along with his history of the Big Book, or his history of AA from Alcoholics Anonymous comes of age, he may be referring to someone or some one of these pictures of either people, places, things, or whatever in our history. And I certainly hope that you'll enjoy the history with the pictures there to give you a much better idea of what that person looked like. I know I'm one of these people who likes to know what people look like when I hear them on a tape or hear about them in a book. And to give you just a brief history of how the first Canadian Big Book seminar came about. This gentleman right here, his name is Wesley Parrish. Wesley Parrish passed away last November. He started a Big Book seminar down in Pompano Beach, Florida. And since Wesley was Pinky's sponsor, Pinky went to the very first one. Now, Pinky and I have been in general service for years, along with Barney and a few other people here. And he wasn't at an assembly. So when I saw Pinky that summer, I wanted to know why wasn't he at the assembly? You know, he was in service work after all. And he was as high as a kite. He was just jumping and floating. And he told me all about this big book seminar that he had been to down in Pompano Beach, and that there was another one coming up that fall. And he turned me on. He really turned me on. Because my sobriety at that time was at a stage where I was going nowhere. I wasn't going forward and I wasn't going backward, yet I was doing everything I'd been told to do. So I said, I'm going. And I went down, and I've been going down ever since. Then a couple of years ago, there were about 3 of us sitting around the swimming pool down there thinking, oh God, isn't this great? Wonderful, isn't it? Gee whiz, this is what, we need this up home, you know. Gosh, I wish we had something like this up home. And you know, when a few alkies get together and somebody gets an idea, the next thing is, well, why not? So we started a few plans rolling and looked at a few sites as prospective places to hold a seminar. Settled on this inn, the Nottawasaga. We're able to line up the team and the hotel for the same date, and it was full speed ahead. And last year was our very first Canadian Big Book Seminar, which is going to be an annual affair. And we're hoping that from this, many more Big Book seminars are going to spring up all across the country. Because this is where it's at. It's in the book.
But I'm an alcoholic, and my name is John Williams. Hi, everybody. I'm a member of the Friday night study group meets here in Pompano. I'll have to miss that tomorrow night. And I'll check Monday to see if they're still in existence Well, as Stuart mentioned, we think that understanding that which we're going to be studying this weekend, and that is the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and most especially the Big Book, it is interesting for us to know, and it is informative for us to know, and it, I think, adds value to that Big Book if we know of the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it, and some of the many episodes which occurred, which, as you read them in the AA Comes of Age, you find, you know, we're pretty lucky folks that this thing even got off the ground. And when we put it together, we thought it would be interesting to go ahead and give you a history of the Big Book, and that's my responsibility this afternoon. As mentioned, what I'm going to do is give you a condensation of a version of this story, which is written in AA Comes of Age. I think it starts on about page 144. Don't try to follow me because I skip around a little bit. Before we get to the beginnings of our Big Book and how it came into being, let's just think a minute about those things and those forces which were occurring, which really brought our fellowship into existence. You know, we count as our date of birth June the 10th, 1935. That's the day Dr. Bob had his last drink, and then we had 2. But you know, the seeds of this thing were sown a few years prior to that date, probably early in the early 1930s, when a man by the name of Roland H. He's not mentioned by name, I don't think, but he's the man who Dr. Jung gave the description of a spiritual experience in our Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous, on or about page 27. Roland had gone, he was a wealthy Vermonter, and he'd gone to see Dr. Jung because he was having trouble drinking and had an alcoholic problem, and he went over to see him and counsel with him, and Dr. Jung gave him a lot of information. And Roland thought by the information that he got that he had found the keys that triggered his mind to drinking. So he came back to the States feeling, of course, that he knew the intricacies of his mind would set off the drinking, and therefore he wouldn't have to make those mistakes and he wouldn't drink. But fortunately, as it ultimately turns out, he came back and found out that he couldn't stay sober. So then he went back to see Dr. Jung again. And at this time, Dr. Jung said, well, the only thing I can tell you, fellas, is that you're probably going to wind up being locked up or going crazy or you're going to die. And Roland said, but isn't there any hope? And then Dr. Jung gave him the prescription for recovery. We didn't know it at that time, but as we look back, he did. In which he said that occasionally men have had what we call a vital spiritual experience, whereby old attitudes and emotions and ideas are cast aside and a new set of attitudes and ideas are picked up. And it seems that in 1932, Roland came back to this country and involved himself in a movement that was called the Oxford Movement, or the Oxford Groups. And it is supposed that Roland never had another drink again. Meanwhile, Roland's sobriety influenced a couple of his friends by the name of Sebra and Shep. And they in turn had a friend called Abby Thatcher. They were all Vermonters and old high school and college chums. And Sebra and Shep tried to help Abby out. And in 1934, Sebra and Shep brought Abby to New York to attend the Oxford Group meetings at the Calvary Church where Sam Shoemaker, and I think Sam Shoemaker's picture's on the wall over there, was holding forth. And in November of that same year, Abby heard about his old college chum, Bill Wilson. Heard he was having a drinking problem, and he went to see him and told Bill what had happened to him, and thus the seeds of our program were planted. The rest of the story, of course, is well documented in terms of Bill having his vital spiritual experience in Town Hospital, staying sober through the early part of 1935, finding himself in Akron, Ohio in May, where he met Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob had one little relapse, and on June the 10th he had his last drink, and so it is said that that's when Alcoholics Anonymous was born. But there were some forces at work prior to that time. Apparently, Bill was visiting Dr. Bob in the fall of 1937, and they began to count heads, and they counted on their fingers and toes and concluded that there were about 40 alcoholics sober at that time, using the method that Abby had prescribed to Bill, the 6 original steps, which I'll get into a little later on. And they were, as they thought about the 40, they began to wonder, and they knew that there were millions of alcoholics out there that needed what they had, but the method that they were using, this word-of-mouth program, was very slow. And they began to wonder how it was that they could carry this message to others. And as in their thinking, and I guess they were thinking out loud, they began to think about hospitals, which didn't want to have to do anything with alcoholics. They could perhaps start a chain of hospitals, and they would need missionaries. This is the term they used, to go out amongst the land and tell the alcoholics the good news about recovery. And then they would perhaps need some literature. They were concerned at this time about the message that they had being garbled and twisted. I don't know why they would think that we alcoholics would garble and twist anything. But they apparently, even with the first 40, found that they were probably beginning to hear some things that made them think that it was necessary that they needed to write down the prescription in black and white. And as they pondered these ideas, Dr. Bob was somewhat cautious and suggested that perhaps they needed to delay these new ideas before the Akron group. And so they called a meeting at an Oxford member's home. His name was Williams. And they decided to lay these new ideas before that group and to see what they thought about them. Well, 18 members met at Henry's house. It's Henry T. Williams. We used to have his picture around here. I don't know what it is or not. By the way, all of these pictures are folks who, as we go back in history, you will see that they played an important part of our being here. Not all of them are alcoholics. A lot of these folks were our friends who helped us out. But as I go through it, perhaps you will take note of the picture if they're on the wall. They met at Henry's house, and this group rejected forthwith the ideas of hospitals, thinking that it was a big business and a racket. And they thought that the paid missionaries would perhaps kill the goodwill of the spirit of what was going on at that time of the man-to-man, eyeball-to-eyeball approach. And many of them at that time wanted to shun publicity because they were afraid that they would not be able to handle the traffic if they became publicly known. Finally, they took a vote, however, and by the slimmest and barest majority out of the 18, they decided that they would go for the whole package: the hospitals, the missionaries, and the literature. And when that was decided, they knew that it would take a lot of money. I mean, you know, hospitals aren't just given to you. It takes money to build hospitals. Missionaries need a lot of money to be subsidized, and it would take a lot of money to do any printing. So they knew that they were going to need a lot of money. Well, in later years, Bill came to be very thankful for that powerful minority, because you see this minority objection that we found at the first meeting there is also going to prevail throughout, and Bill became very thankful for that minority because they ultimately turned out to be right. Their contention that going into big business and having paid missionaries would destroy us turned out to be correct. However, on the other hand, and this was a logical thought, that to have done nothing, Alcoholics Anonymous perhaps would have never gotten off the ground. And actually that was the beginning of what we know today to be group conscious, so we could see it started a long time ago. Well, Bill went to New York with Dr. Bob's blessings and all the members of Akron, and he went to New York all excited about getting some money to do these things. And these New Yorkers now, they like the big ideas. The Midwesterners seem to be a little conservative, but the New York contingent, boy, they liked this idea. They thought it was great, and they probably thought it was going to be the greatest medical and spiritual thing to happen in the 20th century. And so they got together a couple of super salesmen and began to pound the pavement in New York trying to solicit funds for the hospital and the missionaries and the literature. Well, they got zilch. All of these folks they were calling on, they thought that tuberculosis and cancer and March of Dimes and so on and so forth were a lot better charitable recipients than were the alcoholics, who they said, you know, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. So they began to see that alcoholics as a charitable thing was not going to work. And so because of this, Bill got into some sort of a depression about how short-sighted these wealthy people were, because he knew he had a hold of something that was going to take off. I see Bill was a visionary. He knew this early on, and thank God he did. Well, he's in one of these sour moods one day, and he went to see his brother-in-law, Dr. Leonard Strong. And to Dr. Strong, he delivered his thoughts about how short-sighted the rich were and how unsuccessful they had been in soliciting funds. And Dr. Strong listened, and then he says, you know, years ago I used to know a guy by the name of Willard Richardson who had something to do with the Rockefeller Foundation, and perhaps if he's still there, he'll remember me. Let me call him. And so he did, and sure enough, Mr. Richardson remembered Dr. Strong, and Dr. Strong brought him up to date as to what Bill was doing and the success he was having in sobering up alcoholics. And sure enough, Mr. Richardson was interested and suggested they come over the next day for a meeting, and they did. They went over to Rockefeller's office in the RCA building, and they met with Mr. Richardson, and he showed great interest in what they were doing, and he suggested perhaps another meeting. And they set up a luncheon meeting for the following week, and they found out that Mr. Richardson was the guy to see, because he had an inside track to Rockefeller's foundations and his millions. Now, the following week they had lunch. Mr. Richardson continued to show great interest in what we were doing. Then he made another suggestion. He says, why don't we get together again, and I want to bring some of my friends. And he said, I want you to bring some of your New York alcoholics, perhaps Dr. Silkworth, and maybe Dr. Bob and some of the folks from Akron. And so they set up the next meeting, which was held in December of 1937. The members of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I use that term although it wasn't our name at that time, but so we all understand, they found themselves in some pretty unique company that day, and they were awed as they sat in the conference room in the Rockefeller Center. And someone suggested that each alcoholic tell his story, as they do at meetings, and as they told their tales of alcoholic misery and release from same, they could see that they were beginning to make an impression on these fellows. And Mr. Scott finally said, and he exclaimed that this was first century Christianity. And then he says, what can we do to help? Well, these alcoholics thought they had arrived then. They just said, well, boy, this is good news. Now they're going to get out the blank check and just open it up. And Bill mentioned his need for the money to buy the hospital, mentioned the need for subsidizing missionaries and writing literature, and he said it would take a large sum of money to do all of these things. The need was urgent, and he figured that although these undertakings might be considerable, the risk of doing nothing was even greater. Dr. Silkworth expressed the same opinion. And then Mr. Scott posed a question that was eventually to lead to one of our traditions. He said, won't money spoil this thing? The AAs were asked other such questions, like, won't money create a professional class? And would not professional members spoil the eye-to-eye, man-to-man relationship which was going on at that time? And then they said, wouldn't the management of a hospital chain divert you from your main objective? And you know, these were the same kinds of objections that they had heard in Akron, Ohio. And these were coming from people that were outside of the program. And they were good questions indeed. And but they gave them the same argument. They said that they had pondered those types of risk and considered them, but they felt that to do nothing at all was just as perilous. So Mr. Amos, who was a truly close friend of Alcoholics Anonymous, promised to make an investigation of our society at that time to be used as a source of making a recommendation to Mr. Rockefeller to give us money. Well, they suggested that Mr. Amos first go to the Akron, Ohio area because that was the largest group, and that was also where Dr. Bob lived. And if they were to establish a hospital, it seemed logical to them that would be the place to do it. But they didn't mention this in the meeting because they didn't want to embarrass Dr. Bob. Although he'd been sober about 2.5 years at this time, he still had not revived his practice. You see, he was a proctologist, and most of us don't want a proctologist operating on us unless we can be absolutely sure he's sober. And I mean, that's a risk under the best conditions. But if you think you've got an alcoholic dealing with you, you may not turn over. So Mr. Amos did go to Akron, Ohio, and he began to ask questions in the community about Dr. Bob, and he attended some meetings out there. And he found a place, a residence, which could be converted to a hospital if need be. And he came back and he made a glowing report in which he recommended that Mr. Rockefeller give us $50,000 as a starter. And he figured that with this kind of money, they could make a down payment on the hospital, subsidize 2 or 3 members, and perhaps get busy with some of that literature. Mr. Richardson took the report to Mr. Rockefeller, and he even endorsed it further and gave his glowing report of what he had seen and heard about our fellowship. Mr. Rockefeller listened to the presentation. He was impressed, and he said he was impressed. But nevertheless, Mr. Rockefeller flatly refused to give any sum of money, or large sum of money, to Alcoholics Anonymous. And he said, Mr. Richardson, I am afraid that money will spoil this thing. He began to give his reasons, and lo and behold, they were the same reasons that they had heard in the meeting with Amos and that bunch, and they were the same objections that they had heard in the meeting at Akron, Ohio. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was guided then and there to save the fellowship from itself and from the unnecessary hazards of money, property, and professionalism. This was really a turning point in history, in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, although at the moment I'm sure they didn't realize that. We can look back and see that. At this point, Mr. Richardson told Mr. Rockefeller of the financial plight of Dr. Bob and Bill, and Mr. Rockefeller in his generosity decided to put a $5,000 donation into the trust fund at the Riverside Church, and he said that Dr. Bob and Bill could draw upon that as long as it lasted, and he says, please don't ever ask me for another penny. Now, this was good news for us, but of course to those folks it sounded like bad news. But Dr. Bob did get his mortgage paid off, and Dr. Bob and Bill began to draw $30 a week for so long as the money did last. The prospect of missionaries and hospitals in the book had gone dim. All of their new non-alcoholic friends were disappointed, but maybe they knew others who would be interested. You know, Mr. Rockefeller wasn't the only one in New York City that had money, and they knew that. So the forethought it was possible that they could still solicit some funds, and they continued to have meetings to talk about what they could do. By the spring of '39, a definite program of action took shape. It was agreed that they needed a tax-free charitable foundation. Those folks who contributed money to us would then deduct their contributions from their income tax, and it would also serve as a source of responsible money handling, because they had a board of trustees made up primarily of non-alcoholics. They had 5 to begin with. 3 of them were non-alcoholics. 2 of them were alcoholics. Dr. Bob was one of the first trustees, along with another New York alcoholic, who presently got drunk. And at that time, and I'm sure today, that if you're drunk, you immediately resign. So they picked up another trustee from the New York City, and that was our foundation at that time, which ultimately led to what we know today to be our General Service Office. Our non-alcoholic friends, that's Dr. Amos and Mr. Amos and that bunch, came up with a list of wealthy prospects from which we could solicit funds. They really thought that money would not be a problem. As a matter of fact, they hired a guy by the name of Carlton Sherwood, who was a successful fundraiser, to work for them. But he didn't have any success either at raising any funds. He said he didn't have any success because we weren't too sure of what we wanted to do. Sometime in March or April of 1938, Bill began to work on his book. He wrote at that time what we know today to be his story, which is chapter 1 of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, and he wrote chapter 2, which is known, called There is a Solution. These two chapters were used as a source of solicitation of funds. This was the paraphernalia that they were handing out to folks so that they could see what Alcoholics Anonymous was all about. The trustees continue to have these monthly meetings to discuss how they might raise funds and to look at an empty treasury more than anything else. In the early fall of 1938, Frank Amos popped up with an idea which led to the beginnings of some action. He said that one of his friends was a fellow by the name of Eugene Exman, and he was the religious editor of Harper Magazine. And he said that perhaps he would be interested in the new book. Why don't you show him the 2 chapters you have done, and I'll fix it up for you. So an appointment was made for Bill and Mr. Exman, and he went down to see him. Mr. Exman scanned over the 2 chapters that Bill had written, and he asked him if he could do a whole book in the same style, and if so, how long would it take? Bill says, well, I think so. It might take 9 or 10 months. And then Mr. Exman made a proposal, which was an uplifter. He says, well, maybe Harper's might be willing to advance you $1,500 in royalties if that'll help you out. Well, Bill thought about that. It sounded like a good idea, and he couldn't wait to go down to tell his friends about his deal with the Harper Magazine. Well, on his way down, he began to have some misgivings, Bill did. He began to think that a society like ours perhaps ought to own its own literature. And suppose he said one day, and I'm quoting from Bill, that this book would become the basic text of Alcoholics Anonymous, or of the fellowship. Then its principal asset would be owned by an outside publisher. And then he thought of the $1,500 advance, which sounded real good. But he said that when the book was published, it would take an awful lot of books just to pay back the advance. And he said, what if it was a hit? And a lot of people got it, and they started writing to our foundation office for help. How could they support that? How could they finance it? So, although he had misgivings about it, the then Board of Trustees did not think too much of it. They thought the Harper idea was the deal. They thought that was what they ought to do. They thought it was the answer. And Bill then shared with them his misgivings. And then they reminded Bill that the well-known fact that writers seldom publish their own books, and got away with it. And then the meeting ended on a sour note. Now here's where the action on the big book really started. Bill, in his own words, said, soon after the Harper Project, one of the most terrific power drivers I've ever met got into the act. This was my friend Henry P., one-time Standard Oil executive and the first alcoholic to stay sober even a little while in the New York group. He had been a protege of Dr. Silkworth, just as Bill had been, and he was a frequent visitor to Towns Hospital, just as Bill was. At this time, he had been sober 2 years. Henry had red hair, at least one new idea a minute, and energy beyond telling. He was not a foundation trustee, and he had no official say whatever, but that didn't make any difference to him. He was a hard-hitting salesman, and he sold his bill of goods. And he says to Bill, he says, hey, that board of trustees ain't going to do nothing for you. They haven't done anything. They haven't raised one penny, and probably won't. And he says, why don't we put this book on a business-like basis? And he says, and then we can sell shares, and we'll sell it to these folks right here in New York. And if we give them a real argument, I'm sure they'll come up with the money. Being a New York stockbroker, Bill said that he had toyed with such an idea, but he wasn't quite as brave as Henry was with this idea. And Henry breathed confidence. They decided they would organize their own publishing company, and maybe they would have to forget the foundation. Bill told Henry that the foundation would never agree to their scheme, but Henry's skin was thicker than Bill's. He said it had to be done. And so finally Bill agreed to that. Bill, out of courtesy, did go to see Mr. Exman at Harper Magazine to tell him what they were about to do, and to his amazement, Mr. Harper said, yes, I think a society like yours should own its own literature, and it should control it. Well, when the Board of Trustees were told of Mr. Exman's opinion, they didn't buy that either. But it did give Bill and Henry the kind of encouragement that they needed. Now, Henry didn't waste any time selling this proposition to these New York drunks. He threatened, he did everything in this world, but he didn't come up with no money. These New Yorkers weren't buying that deal. They says, how can you got a heck of a nerve trying to sell us stock in a book that hadn't even been published or written yet? Meanwhile, Henry and Bill were perfecting their plan. They decided to come up with a prospectus, some black and white, some information that they could perhaps sell these New York alcoholics on. And they found out that a book could be published for about 10% of its retail cost. They found out that the book they had in mind might cost about $3.50. And so when they figured out that 10% of that was about 35 cents, they go make a lot of money. And Henry came up with a prospectus for 100,000 books, 500,000 books, 1 million books. I mean, he had big ideas about how much money they will make in the sale of that book. The prospectus showed that a company would be formed with stock of $25 par value. The New York alcoholics and their friends could buy 1/3 of the shares for cash. The other 2/3 would be distributed between Henry and Bill for their work. And to satisfy the trustees, they decided that they would give the trustees the author's royalties so that they could have some money. And then they attached to this prospectus, or attached the prospectus to the proposition, and they had fantastic ideas about how much money they were going to make. Now, Bill and Henry realized that their enterprise still lacked two essentials. One, it was not incorporated, and two, that they didn't have any stocks on which to base their company. Nor a name, and since the forthcoming book would be one of many works, they thought that the publishing company ought to be called Works Publishing Incorporated. Now, that's one story that comes out of AA Comes of Age, and I see and pass it on that the idea that they perhaps named it because they thought about faith without works is dead, and that perhaps came from there. But this is a story in AA Comes of Age. Bill complained that they didn't have a corporation and that they didn't have, and in order to form a corporation, they would take money. They didn't have any money. But Henry took care of this, you see. Henry went down to a bookstore, apparently, and he bought a blank pad of stock certificates. And across the top of them, he typed Works Publishing Incorporated, and down at the bottom, he signed Henry Parkhurst, President. So, there was no problem for Henry. So the great enterprise was launched. It was remained to see if it would float. And then Henry knew every trick of the trade. He went again and tried to sell these shares to these New York drunks, and nobody bought anything. And he said to Bill one day, he says, you and I know this book's going to sell, and Harper thinks it's going to sell, but these New York drunks just don't believe it. Some take it as a joke, and the rest just talk high and mighty about mixing spiritual enterprise with money and promotion. But if they really did think that this book would sell, they'd buy stock, and they'd buy it real fast. And he says, why don't we go down to Harper Reader's Digest and see if those folks would be interested in printing an article about us once the book is published. See, now that's a good idea Henry had. And so they did go down. 2 days later, they were in the office of the managing editor, Kenneth Payne, and they told him of their glowing report of their book enterprise, and they told him of Mr. Rockefeller's keen interest in their society. And Mr. Payne says, you know what? He says the Reader's Digest just might be interested in such things. Sounds like something we'd be interested in. But he said, of course, I will have to check it up with my other editors. You do understand that, don't you? Well, when he showed any interest at all, I can just picture Bill and Henry running out the door. They didn't hear that. I'll have to check it up with my other editors. They were on their way to New York to tell their friends of the good news that Reader's Digest was interested in their book. And you know, when they got back down to New York and told them that Reader's Digest was interested, they began to sell some of those shares. And they made it easy for them. They could say, $5 a month for 5 months. They did it on the installment plan. Charlie Towns chipped in a few. Bill and some of his old Wall Street cronies chipped in. We were taking a lot of money from outsiders at that time. It didn't matter. We didn't have these traditions yet. And they began to solicit, and they solicited about $2,500 or $5,000 worth of shares. And after receiving the assurance, of course, that the book might receive on that book. They had an office at 17 William Street in Newark, New Jersey. It belonged to Henry. Henry had a company which was floundering. It was called Honor Dealers Incorporated. It was a corporation of service station dealers who got together so that they could have a better buying market or a better buying power. Every morning, Bill would travel from Brooklyn down to this office and dictate and redictate the chapters to Ruth Hawk, who was our secretary, or who was Henry's secretary at the time. And he worked from a hastily drawn up list of possible chapter headings. He didn't really have any idea where he was going. He just had some chapter headings. Week after week, Henry paced around trying to solicit money from these people who had the stock by the installment plan to make sure that money came in. They got a loan from Charlie Towns, as I mentioned. As the chapters were slowly roughed out, Bill read them to the New York group at its weekly meetings, and then copies were sent to Akron for Dr. Bob and his bunch to peruse. And in Akron, Ohio, the book got nothing but the warmest reception. But this was not the case in New York. Those New Yorkers gave that book a mauling. I mean, they had some Donnybrooks, according to the way it's described to me. They just argued about everything. But Bill would try to retype it and try to stay on top of everything, but he was having trouble in New York, and Akron was agreeing with everything he sent to them. Bill had done his own story and had drafted 3 more copies, or 3 more chapters entitled More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics, and that chapter there is a solution. It was now realized that they had done enough background and window dressing material in the front of the book, and it was at this point that Bill felt that the heart and soul of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous needed to be inserted. And this problem had secretly worried Bill because he had never written anything. Bill was not an author, and neither had any other member of the New York faction. And the progress on the book had been slow, and some of the stock subscribers had slacked off on their contributions. The hassle over the 4 chapters already finished had been terrific. Bill was exhausted, and on many a day he felt like just throwing that book right out the window. And he was in anything but a spiritual mood on the night when the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous were written. He was sore, he was tired, he was exhausted, he was depressed, and he lay in bed in the December evening in 1938 with a pencil in hand and a tablet and a scratch pad. Bill couldn't get his mind on the job, much less put his heart into it, but it was one of those things he felt had to be done. Slowly his mind came into some sort of focus, and he began to think about Ebby's visit in the fall of 1934. And since that visit, the program had gradually evolved into what they called the word-of-mouth program. Most of the basic ideas came from the Oxford groups, came from Williams James and Dr. Silkworth. Though subject to considerable variation, it all boiled down into a procedure which comprised 6 steps. And these were the 6 steps that they had at that time. 1, we admitted that we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. 2, we made a moral inventory of our defects of sins. 3, we confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. 4, we made restitutions to all those we had harmed by our drinking. 5, we tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward in money or prestige. And 6, we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for the power to practice these concepts. Now this was it. This is what they had. I don't know where they came from. I haven't found out yet. The Oxford movement didn't have 6 such steps written down anywhere. But this was basically what Ebby told Bill the first time he visited him. There was still considerable disagreement between the Eastern and the Midwestern viewpoint. AA people in the Midwest, this is the Akron and Cleveland area, were still active Oxford group participants. But while those in New York had withdrawn the year before, 1937. In Akron and vicinity, they still like to talk about the Oxford group's 4 absolutes. Absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. This dose was found to be a little too rich for the New Yorkers, and they had abandoned these expressions some time ago. But all of AA East and West were placing increasing emphasis upon Dr. Silkworth's expression describing the alcoholic's dilemma, the obsession plus the allergy. By then, AA knew from experience that the new prospect had to accept step 1 or get no place. Things haven't changed much, have they? Bill's mind ran over these developments, and it seemed to him that the program was still not definite enough. It might be a long time before readers of the book in distant places could be personally contacted. Therefore, he thought, and this is underlined or written in italics in the AA Comes of Age, therefore AA literature would have to be as clear and comprehensive as possible. The steps would have to be more explicit. The steps, there must not be a single loophole through which the rationalizing alcoholic could wiggle out of. I mean, that was only after about 3 years of experience in this fellowship they knew all that. Maybe the 6 chunks of truth, that was those 6 steps, would have to be broken into smaller pieces. Thus, AA could better get the distant reader over the barrel. See, they were concerned about literature and getting the distant reader over the barrel. Bill started to write this December evening in 1938. He set out to draft more than 6 steps. Just how many, he had no idea. He relaxed, and this is what I think is important, he asked for guidance. Then he described it with speed that is astonishing. He completed the first draft. It took perhaps 30 minutes, folks. The words kept right on coming. When Bill reached a stopping point, he numbered the new steps. They added up to 12. Somehow that number seemed significant. Without any special rhyme or reason, Bill connected them with the 12 apostles. About the time Bill finished the steps, he had 2 late callers. One was a guy by the name of Howard C., and he had a pigeon with him, who was barely dry 3 months. Bill read him this new steps that he had just finished and completed, and then Howard and his friend reacted violently. Howard says, "Why 12 steps? You know how we reluctant to change. They had 6 before Howard walked in that house, and now they had 12. And he wasn't too happy about that. And what do you mean getting these drunks down on their knees? As we will review what the original 12 steps had to say, because I think Charlie will go into those this afternoon. And who wants all their shortcomings removed? Some of this stuff sounds pretty good, but he says, I think you got too much God in this deal. And they argued, and they had heated discussions, and it was only broken when Lois finally came in and suggested that they have a cup of coffee. Bill sprang to the defense of his new set of steps. He defended every word of it to Howard and his pigeon. Now, the people in Akron liked the 12 steps very much, and the remainder of the book text developed based on the 12 steps. They continued to report their approval. But in New York, the hot debate about the 12 steps and the book's contents were doubled and redoubled. There were the conservative, the liberal, and the radical viewpoints. Very interesting, because these are the viewpoints which went into the makeup of our big book. Fitz M., and his picture's back there on the wall, was a conservative from Maryland. And he thought the book ought to be a Christian in its doctrinal sense, and it ought to use biblical terms. Others of his faction also thought that ought to be that way. Liberals, they didn't have any objections to the Word of God in the big book, but they were strictly against any theological statements or teachings. Spirituality, they said yes. Religion, no. And then the radicals, which Jimmy Burwell over there with a pipe in his mouth was one, and the leader, he said that God should not even be in the book at all. They were set against any theological or religious proposition, and they were made up, the contingent of the atheists and agnostics made up this bunch. So it was these 3 factions which argued and influenced the spiritual pitch and tone of our book. And the liberals were the largest faction, but the combined forces of the radicals and the conservatives outweighed them just a little bit. And Jimmy Burwell and his company wanted a psychological book as opposed to a theological or a religious book. So every voice was playing its appointed part in the creation of the outcome of this book. Bill, who had to do all the writing, was caught in the middle of the arguing, and they had some horrendous arguments, as I mentioned. The liberals were the larger group, but they barely outnumbered the combined conservatives and the radicals. And for a while, it looked like they would bog down into permanent disagreement. Bill finally asked that he might be the final judge of what this book said. Seeing that they wouldn't get anywhere unless they agreed to that, they did agree that that Bill Wilson would be the final judge of what went into the book. And then, once they made that agreement, they began to progress. In a short time, it was evident that something else was needed in the book, and this was when it was decided that they would do the story section. That was a section of the book which would, once the reader in the distant place saw how the program worked, they would give witness or testimony by printing stories in the back of the book. And they did the case histories. 18 stories came from the Akron, Ohio area, and New York added 10 stories. Then, after they decided on that and they got the stories put together, a note of caution came up, and they said, "How do we know for sure this book will be widely accepted by everybody? Maybe it still contains some medical and maybe some psychological material that might be offensive to some. Had they not better find out?" Well, 400 copies of the mimeograph copies of the big book were printed up and sent out to various and sundry people for their edification. And on each one of them, they stamped loan copy so that their copyright would not be infringed upon. And while they were waiting for these mimeograph copies to come back to them, two hot controversies got under the way. Though Bill had labeled the mimeograph issue Alcoholics Anonymous, this title was still unacceptable to a great many people. Some of the titles that they had thought about was The 100 Men, The Empty Glass, The Dry Way, The Dry Life, Dry Frontiers, and The Way Out. The Akron and the New York groups had been voting for months on possible titles. As a matter of fact, this came to be the great Akron meeting fun thing to do, is to try to come up with a title for this book. And the title Alcoholics Anonymous had appeared early probably in October of 1938. After the New Yorkers had left the Oxford groups in 1937, they described themselves as a nameless bunch of alcoholics. And from this phrase, according to Bill, it was only a step to the idea of Alcoholics Anonymous, and this was how we actually derived our name. Bill had liked this title very much. From the start, the title, The Way Out, was the most popular. If they gave that book that name, then Bill could add his signature. He liked that idea, of course, by Bill W. And Bill thought, why shouldn't an author sign his book? And then Bill began to forget that it was not his book, it was everybody's book. If you'll remember all the arguments they had and all the input, it was not his book. And in one dark moment, Bill said he even considered calling the book the BW Movement. And when he told and whispered this idea to a couple of his friends, they promptly busted his balloon with a pen. They considered more than 100 titles, as I've mentioned some of them. And as I say, the title The Way Out was the most popular at that time, but here an advantage presented itself in New York. Most likely Bill W. seized upon it. Bill sent a wire to Fitz, who was the minister's son who lived in Maryland. He was on his farm at that time, and Bill asked him to visit the Library of Congress in Washington and find out how many books are entitled The Way Out and how many books are entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. And a couple of days later, Fitz wired back to Bill, and it says, "The Library of Congress shows 12 books titled The Way Out. No book there is called Alcoholics Anonymous." Well, they knew that they didn't want to be the 13th way out, and so they left the title Alcoholics Anonymous in the copy that went to the printer, and this is how we got the title to our book, and this is how our society eventually got its name. Just before the manuscript was finished, an event of great significance took place. At times, it looks just like another battle over the book. The scene was in Henry's office in New York, where most of the writing had been done. Present were Fitz, Henry, and our secretary Ruth, and Bill Wilson. They were still arguing about the 12 steps. All this time, Bill had refused to budge. He just absolutely refused to budge. Charlie and Joe will get into ways in which he overcame some of these considerations. He would not change a word of the original draft, in which you will remember he had consistently used the word God. And in one place, the expression "on our knees" was used. Praying to God on one's knees was still a big affront to Henry. He argued, he begged, and he threatened. He quoted Jimmy B. as his source. He was positive that it would scare alcoholics off by the thousands. And little by little, both Fitz and Ruth came to see the merit of his contention. And though at first Bill would have none of it, he finally began to talk about a possible method of compromise. Now, who first suggested this? Not known. No one's given credit for it. But the words are well known throughout the length and breadth of Alcoholics Anonymous today. In step 2, it was decided to describe God as a power greater than ourselves. And in step 3 and 11, we inserted the word God as we understood Him. From step 7, they deleted the expression "on our knees." And as a lead-in sentence to all the steps, they wrote these words: "Here are the steps we took which are suggested as a program of recovery." AA's 12 steps were to be suggestions only. Such were the final concessions of those with little or no faith. That was the great contribution of the atheists and the agnostics. They really had widened the gate of Alcoholics Anonymous so that all those who might suffer or who suffered might enter, regardless of their belief or their lack of belief. God was certainly there in our steps, but He was now expressed in terms that anybody at all, could accept or try. Nothing remained now except to prepare the printer's copy of the book. They selected a mimeographed copy in Henry's clear handwriting with all the corrections, and then they went to New York and soon found themselves face to face with Mr. Edward Blackwell, president of Cornwall Press. This was the outfit that was going to print our book. And in high spirits, they told him they were ready to go. Mr. Blackwell wanted to know how many copies to print. With the Reader's Digest article in mind, they were still thinking of carloads. Though doubtlessly impressed, Mr. Blackwell suggested $5,000 books for the first printing. Then he asked them what financial terms they were able to make. They cautiously let it be known that their cash was temporarily low, pointing out that the Reader's Digest article would do for them. And Henry mentioned a figure of maybe a $500 deposit as a down payment on the 5,000 books. Mr. Blackwell was somewhat startled, and he looked at, and he says, "What about this Rockefeller contention?" And then Henry, in his logical mind, said, "Well, we're holding that in the background in case we need it." Mr. Blackwell, who had already caught the spirit of our fellowship, agreed to print 5,000 books with a $500 deposit. When making the arrangements with Mr. Blackwell, they did fix the retail price of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous at $3.50. Even this was as a result of long arguments between the members of AA. Some members had insisted on a $1 book. Others wanted a $2.50 printing. They had turned deaf ears to Henry's plea that they must make something on the deal, or else he'd never be able to operate a headquarters office, much less pay off the shareholders. But Henry finally won through, as he always did, it seemed. And as a consolation to the contestants, they directed Mr. Blackwell to do the job on the thickest paper in his shop. The original volume proved to be so bulky that it became known as the Big Book. Of course, the idea was really to convince the alcoholic that he was really getting his money's worth. Very soon, Henry, Ruth, and Dorothy S. of Cleveland and Bill wheeled into Mr. Blackwell's big printing press in Blackwell in Cornwall, New York, and checked into their own hotel. They brought with them that mangled copy of the printer's copy of the Alcoholics Anonymous. And when the Cornwall manager saw what they had to make these plates off of, he almost sent them back to New York. But they finally persuaded him to go along with what they had, and they took the galleys and corrected them on a daily basis. All the time in which the big book was in preparation, no one had thought of getting in touch with the Reader's Digest to let them know that they were just around the corner from getting this book. Somehow the question of timing their article with the appearance of the book had not occurred to them, and Henry and Bill again rode up the Parkway towards Pleasantville and began to wonder about this. They estimated it might take months to produce the promised piece, but why worry? It was just a question of time anyhow. Bill and Henry were greeted by the managing editor, Payne, at the door of his office. He didn't remember exactly who they were when they first came into that office, and then Henry said, "Well, we're ready to shoot," and Mr. Payne said, "Shoot what?" And then they brought him up to date. Then he finally began to remember who they were, and he says, "Oh, yeah, you're the two guys from that Fellowship of Alcoholics, and you wanted the Digest to do a piece about your book that you were about to write." "Yes, it's all coming to me now, but you said, you remember I told you that I'd have to check it out with my other editors?" And he said, "I did, and much to my dismay, they didn't want to do it. He said it might be too controversial, medically speaking and religiously speaking, so they weren't going to do an article on the book." Well, the air was really out of their balloon at this time, and they went back to New York. Henry finally, in Bill's description, was really dejected as a result of this. He was really depressed, and he was shattered at the idea that Reader's Digest was not going to do this piece because they'd put so much confidence in it. They rode home in a daze, and they wondered how they would face the groups. You know, they just knew when they got back and told the groups about that, they were going to say, "We told you so." But you know, when they got back and told the groups about it, they wondered where their faith was. They said, "It'll be all right, no problem." The homecoming proved less disastrous than they expected, and a few people did say, "We told you so." There's always those few. But nearly everybody else took a sporting attitude and asked what become of their faith. The trustees were nice about it too. They suggested weekly meetings to see what they could do about it. And it was obvious, you see, that they needed to get some publicity to take the place of that which they had depended upon in the Reader's Digest article. It was April of 1939. Henry was absolutely broke, and he was trying to get some work. Ruth was living at home, and she was not being paid in money. She was being given worthless pieces of stock from the Works Publishing Company as pay, but she gladly went along. There were reviews in the book after it got printed, primarily by religious periodicals, which had no influence so far as book sales were concerned. I don't imagine you get on to number one by letting these folks review your book. Again, attempts to get magazines to print articles about Alcoholics Anonymous had failed. One day, a member by the name of Morgan came up with an idea. This is an interesting story. He said, I used to be in the ad business and had a good deal to do with radio business. I know Gabriel Heater very well, and I'm sure he'd give us a hand. So off he went to see Mr. Heater, and he was soon back, and sure enough, Mr. Heater agreed to give them a break. In those days, Mr. Heater was on National Network with a program called We the People, consisting of 3-minute interviews. The AA story appealed to him right away, and then he planned to interview Morgan. His rise and his fall, and they were going to mention the fact that there was a book available. Henry's promotional instincts were instantly revived. He came out of his depression immediately, and the wheels began to turn. He decided that it would be a good idea to send postcards to all the physicians east of the Mississippi River. There were 20,000 of them, and the card would ask the physician to be sure to listen to Mr. Heater's radio program and order the book Alcoholics Anonymous, A Sure Cure for Alcoholism. Now here was another great idea that Henry had. The only thing is they didn't have any money to do it. But somehow or another, Henry's ingenuity prevailed. He was able to extract from a member $500. He made a loan of $500 in order to buy these postcards and pay the postage on it. And he sent thousands of these postcards to physicians east of the Mississippi. Gabriel Heater, meanwhile, set a date for Morgan's appearance. It was only a week away, and they were all excited. Then someone sounded a note of caution. What if the lately released insane asylum inmate Morgan should be drunk on the day of the broadcast? Experience told them, of course, that this was a real possibility. How could such a calamity be converted or averted? Very gently, they suggested to a resentful Morgan that he would have to be locked up somewhere until the night of the broadcast. I can just imagine. It took all of Henry's talents to put that one over, but sure enough, he did. How and where they would lock him up was the only remaining question. Thank God they didn't put him in jail. He recalled that one of the newer members in New York had a membership in the Downtown Athletic Club. They kept Morgan there until broadcast time. They took turns staying with him right around the clock, never letting him out of their sight. Once more, talk was heard of book sales by the carloads. An hour before broadcast time, the whole membership and their families gathered around the radios waiting for the great moment. And sure enough, right on time, Henry Morgan came onto the radio with Gabriel Heater, and he done a great job. And then they plugged the book, made mention of it. Well, Henry and Bill and Ruth were excited about the broadcast, and they held themselves in check for 3 days before they went down to the post office to see what the results of those postcards were going to be. They knew that it would just, matter of fact, the 3 of them went down there, and each of them carried a suitcase in each hand to bring back the postcards and the orders for the new book. And as I say, they waited 3 days before they went down there. And then when they went down there and they looked in this little window in the post office and they saw a little handful of postcards and they were dismayed. And Henry says, never mind. He says, they got them by the sackfuls in the back. They just ain't got no place to put them. So they called the mail clerk out and he said, we're here to pick up our mail. And the guy handed him about 12 of these postcards. He said, there's got to be more. And he says, this is it. 12 postcards. Another one of Henry's promotional ideas down the drain. Most of the responses they got were scribbled by apparent physicians who were in their cups, and I think they did get 1 or 2 book orders as a result. A few days later, our landlord in Newark really got tough. The sheriff appeared with an eviction notice. They moved into a smaller office and wondered how many months it would be before the sheriff would show up again to kick them out. Somehow the book had to be revived. After nearly 4 years of sobriety, Bill had no prospect of any income or the certainty of any place to live. By July, Henry had found himself a job, so the revival of the book was primarily left to Bill and to Ruth. One day in July, Bill went to visit Mr. Charles Towns in New York City. At this time, our fellowship owed Mr. Towns an awful lot of money. Both men had cheerfully gone along with the deal, and Bill stepped up to the elevator and was greeted by Charlie. And Charlie says he had known Morris Markey. He was a well-known feature writer. And he was intrigued with the story of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Mr. Markey had approached Fulton Osler, who was the editor of the Liberty magazine, who was a great friend to be of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he saw the possibilities and commissioned Morris Markey to do an article about us. So Mr. Towns wanted to know, or Dr. Towns wanted to know when Bill could get started. Morris soon had an article called Alcoholics and God. It appeared in the September issue of Liberty magazine, 1939. This time they really hoped and believed that they had turned the corner, and indeed they had. In September of 39, the Liberty piece hit the newsstand. The magazine received 800 urgent replies for help, which were promptly turned over to Ruth and Bill. Ruth wrote fine personal letters to each and every one of them, enclosing a leaflet describing the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. The response was great. Several hundred books were sold at once at full retail price of $3.50. Even more importantly, they struck up a correspondence with alcoholics and their friends and families throughout the United States. AA was on the march and out of its infancy into adolescence. Lois and Bill happily watched as the turn of events began to unfold. One sad incident marred the early spring of 1940. Not knowing where any of them would be living in the future, they had chose box 658 at one of New York's downtown post offices as the most central point of the whole metropolitan New York area. It now seemed right for them to find an office in that location. But Henry didn't like the idea. Henry's job was in western New Jersey. He objected violently to the idea of moving that office to New York. He wanted the book business, and he wanted Ruth wherever he went. His job wasn't going too well, and he was on what we know today to be a dry drunk. The more they insisted on the central location, the more violent Henry became. Finally, he broke down completely, went on a terrific drunk after 4 years of sobriety, and he never again showed any real progress of recovery. AA's expansion has been immensely accelerated by the Liberty article and the frantic growth in Cleveland. Tiny beginnings have been made in many other towns and cities throughout the United States. 1941, Jack Alexander wrote an article about Alcoholics Anonymous in the Saturday Evening Post March issue. During that year, the membership in Alcoholics Anonymous jumped from 2,000 to 8,000, a tremendous increase. And since that time, Alcoholics Anonymous has been on the move. It has been growing. And this big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, has been the central core. It has stood the test of time. It has been with us long enough. And this is the book that we're going to be studying this week in, and I hope that by knowing now a little bit about those events which occurred, which brought this precious instrument into being, will make the weekend more meaningful. Thank you very much.